The moment Elliot stepped into Hollow Brook, he didn't just feel the weight of its history, he felt the weight of something far heavier, something that seemed to be waiting for him. It whispered in the dark corners of his mind, calling his name, pulling him deeper into the mystery. Each breath he took felt suffocating, as though the very air around him was thick with secrets, regrets, and things that should have been forgotten. As the whispers grew louder, he realized something terrifying. Hollow Brook wasn't just a town. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had chosen him. But what it wanted was something no one should ever have to give. Would he walk away, or would he become the one to finally uncover the truth, even if it meant sacrificing everything he ever loved? Elliot Turner had always been drawn to the unknown. A writer for Mystery Unveiled, a magazine renowned for its exploration of the most bizarre and cryptic tales, Elliot spent his days immersed in cold case files, obscure legends, and unsolved mysteries. Each story was a puzzle waiting to be pieced together, a thread to unravel until the truth lay bare in front of him. It was a life that fed his curiosity, and he had grown comfortable within the carefully constructed world of the eerie and the unexplained. But as he sat at his cluttered desk one cold, dreary morning in early fall, reading the letter that had just arrived at his doorstep, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: unease. The envelope was old-fashioned, a creamy parchment-like paper sealed with wax. The handwriting on the front was elegant but strange, slanting in ways that made it difficult to read. He opened it with curiosity, shaking his head as he glanced at the letterhead: The Hollow Brook Historical Society. The letter itself was short, terse even, but it contained a warning that immediately sparked a flicker of excitement and dread in Elliot's chest. Dear Mr. Turner, we hope this letter finds you well. We have read with great interest your previous works on the subject of unexplained phenomena, particularly those regarding towns that seem to have been forgotten by history itself. It is for this reason that we are reaching out to you. The town of Hollow Brook, located in New Hampshire, has long been a place of whispered rumors and untold secrets. While it is not a place that appears on most modern maps, its history is buried deep in local archives, and its fate is steeped in mystery. We request your assistance in uncovering the truth behind these happenings, and we believe you may be the only one capable of unraveling the secrets that have long haunted this place. There have been recent reports of strange occurrences, including strange voices heard on the wind, figures that vanish without a trace, and inexplicable disappearances. We implore you to visit Hollow Brook, investigate these phenomena, and help us understand the forces at work within our town. We await your response. Sincerely, the Hollow Brook Historical Society. The words were chilling, but it wasn't just the content of the letter that intrigued Elliot. It was the ominous tone, the urgency that seemed to pulse from every line. He had read his share of strange invitations, of course. Editors would sometimes send him leads on unsolved mysteries, obscure towns with their own urban legends, and sometimes he would follow the threads. But something about this letter felt different, felt more personal. It was as if the town of Hollow Brook had been waiting for someone like him, someone who had the ability to uncover what lay hidden. After a moment's hesitation, Elliot leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. He thought about the stories that had caught his attention in the past, the ones that led him on wild goose chases, dead ends, and nights spent lying awake with only the sound of his own racing heartbeat for company. But this felt different. There was a darkness lurking behind the words, something that went beyond just a story or a mystery to be solved. He glanced out the window of his small apartment in Boston. The sky was gray. The city was buzzing with the usual noise, and he could hear the faint sound of car horns in the distance. But in that moment, Hollow Brook felt impossibly far away. It felt like a place he could not reach, yet one that was somehow reaching for him. With a deep breath, Elliot picked up the phone and dialed his editor's number. He had always trusted Sarah Morgan's instincts. If she had sent him this letter, there had to be something to it. Hello? Sarah's voice crackled through the receiver. Sarah, it's Elliot, he said, leaning back in his chair again. I got the letter. Hollowbrook, right? Ah, I knew you'd be interested, she replied, a hint of excitement in her voice. I thought you'd be the perfect person for this. The town's been off the radar for years, but I've heard rumors, strange ones. You mean the kind of rumors that make you wonder if it's worth investigating? Elliot asked, a wry smile forming on his lips. Sarah hesitated before speaking again. Something's off about this one, Elliot. They ask for you specifically. And let's just say I've looked into it. There are reports. Not just the typical ghost stories, but people disappearing. Not just from Hollowbrook, but from the nearby towns, too. You need to be careful. Elliot's fingers tightened around the phone, the weight of her words sinking in. Disappearing people? That's unusual. I'm serious, Elliot. People go in, and they don't come out. The Historical Society knows something they're not telling you. But I know how you are, you'll figure it out. Just be careful. The town has a way of getting under your skin. Elliot rubbed his temples. His editor's warning only fueled his curiosity. He had heard of strange towns before, places where time seemed to move differently, or where the veil between the living and the dead was thinner. But this sounded different. This wasn't just a place, it was an enigma. A town lost in time, forgotten by the world, yet somehow still haunting the edges of reality. I'll leave tomorrow, Elliot said, determination settling in his chest. I'll head to Hollowbrook and see what I can find. Maybe they're not the only ones who have been waiting for someone to uncover their secrets. The next morning, Elliot packed his things. A small suitcase, a notebook, a voice recorder, and of course his trusty camera. The weather had turned colder overnight, and as he drove out of the city and toward the more remote regions of New Hampshire, he noticed the landscape becoming increasingly barren. The further he drove, the fewer signs of civilization he saw. Just dense forests and stretches of empty road. Hollowbrook was located deep in the woods, far from any major highways or bustling towns. The car's tires crunched over gravel as he took a narrow, winding road, his headlights illuminating only the dark silhouettes of trees that seemed to close in around him. A chill crept through the air, even though it was still early afternoon. As he rounded a bend, Elliot saw the sign for Hollowbrook, its paint faded and barely legible. The letters were worn, the sign itself leaning precariously to one side. It was as if the town had been abandoned by both the world and time itself. The first hint of the eerie atmosphere the Historical Society had warned him about hung thick in the air. Elliot slowed the car, peering down the empty streets as he passed. There were no people, no sounds, just the heavy silence of a town that seemed suspended in time. It was as though the world beyond this place had forgotten Hollowbrook even existed. He parked outside a small inn near the town center, its windows dark, and the sign above the door creaking in the wind. As he stepped out of the car, a cold gust of wind swept through the streets, carrying with it an unsettling sound. A faint whisper, barely audible, as though the wind itself was trying to speak. Elliot swallowed, his heart racing, and walked toward the inn. Something was waiting for him. He wasn't sure what, but he was certain of one thing. His arrival would be the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. The Hollowbrook Inn was an old, weather-worn building that looked like it had seen better days, decades, maybe even centuries ago. It stood at the edge of the town's main street, its paint chipped and peeling, revealing the raw wood beneath. The windows were dark, only a faint glimmer of light leaking through the cracks in the curtains. The sign hanging above the door swayed gently in the wind, creaking ominously in the silence of the town. The place seemed as much a part of the town's forgotten history as the cobblestone streets and overgrown trees surrounding it. Elliot stood in front of the inn for a moment, taking in the sight. The air felt colder now, the breeze carrying a faint smell of mildew and decay. He was still trying to shake the unease that had crept up on him the moment he'd entered Hollowbrook, but there was no turning back now. He had made a commitment, and he intended to uncover whatever secrets this place was hiding, no matter how strange or dangerous they might be. With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air inside was thick, with dust, and the creaky floorboards groaned underfoot as he made his way to the front desk. The dim lighting cast long, unsettling shadows across the room, and the smell of stale wood and something far older than dust hung in the air. A fireplace sat in one corner, but it was cold and unused, the hearth empty. The only sound in the room was the slow ticking of an ancient clock on the wall. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman, her back hunched as she meticulously arranged a pile of papers. Her hair, white as snow, was tied back into a tight bun, and she wore a faded black dress that seemed to have been chosen more for practicality than style. She didn't seem surprised by his arrival, nor did she look up when he entered. The only sign that she noticed him was the faint rustling of her paper as she shuffled it slightly. "Excuse me," Elliot said, trying to mask the discomfort he felt. "I'm looking for a room, The woman's head snapped up so suddenly that Elliot took an involuntary step back. Her pale blue eyes locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to cut right through him. It was the kind of gaze that made you feel like she could see the deepest parts of you, as if she knew things about you that you hadn't yet discovered yourself. "You must be Mr. Turner," she said, her voice soft, but carrying an edge of something, unsettling, like it had been practiced for years. "We've been expecting you." Elliot froze, caught off guard. "You have?" The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, I know who you are. I know why you're here." She paused, her gaze drifting over him for a moment before returning to his face. "You've come for the answers. You've come to see the truth." Elliot felt his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. There was something unnerving about her, something almost predatory in her calm demeanor. He had read about towns where the inhabitants seemed to know too much about outsiders, but this was different. This felt personal. "How do you know who I am?" Elliot asked, his voice steady, though the unease was growing. He hadn't told anyone in the town about his purpose for visiting, hadn't even called ahead to book a room. "I know everything about everyone who stays here," she replied cryptically, her gaze never wavering. "This town, it remembers. You are not the first to come seeking answers, and you won't be the last." Elliot's mind raced as he processed her words. "You're saying this town has a memory?" Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Oh yes, this town remembers. It remembers the things it shouldn't. It remembers the ones who disappeared, the ones who left without a trace, and it remembers the ones who were never meant to come back." Elliot swallowed hard, unsure how to respond to her cryptic tone. The fact that she knew about the disappearances, about the very reason he had come, made him more certain than ever that something was deeply wrong with Hollowbrook. I just need a place to stay for the night," Elliot stammered, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "Do you have a room available?" The woman's smile faded slightly, her eyes narrowing as she regarded him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached beneath the desk and pulled out an old brass key. The number on the key tag was 13. "This will be your room," she said, sliding the key across the desk toward him. "Room 13. It's on the second floor, just down the hall. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow you'll need it." Elliot hesitated before taking the key. "Tomorrow?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply turned her gaze back to the pile of papers in front of her, as though the conversation was over. "You'll see. You'll see soon enough." With no other choice, Elliot took the key and made his way up the stairs. The staircase creaked under his weight, and the sound echoed unnervingly in the empty hallway. As he reached the second floor, he noticed that the doors to the rooms were all shut tightly, and there was no sound from within. Everything was still, too still. He reached room 13, his heart pounding in his chest, and unlocked the door. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the nightstand. The bed was large and covered with an old quilt that looked as though it hadn't been washed in years. The air was musty, and there was a strange heaviness to it, like the room had been shut off from the world for far too long. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was dated, as if it hadn't been updated in decades. Elliot stepped inside and closed the door behind him. As he placed his suitcase on the bed, a shiver ran down his spine. The room felt wrong, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts swirling. He had come to Hollowbrook seeking answers to uncover the truth about the strange disappearances that had plagued the town. But now that he was here, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that knew he was here and had been waiting for him to arrive. The silence outside the window was thick, oppressive, and the whispers from earlier seemed to be growing louder, filling the room with an unseen presence. As Elliot lay back on the bed, his mind raced with questions. What was the Hollowbrook Historical Society hiding? Why had they sent for him? And most importantly, what was the truth that lay hidden in this cursed town? Before he could formulate more questions, the door to his room creaked open. Though he was certain he hadn't heard anyone approach, Elliot froze. The whispers were no longer in the wind. They were here, inside the room. Elliot's heart slammed against his ribs as he sat up abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. The door to his room was wide open, and yet he was certain he hadn't heard anyone come in. He stared at the doorway, but there was no figure standing there. No one to explain the creak of the door or the thickening silence that now filled the room. A chill ran down his spine, colder than the wind outside. The whispers had stopped, but only for a moment. It was as if they were waiting, gathering strength. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. His words felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive silence that clung to the room. He hesitated, then stood up, moving slowly toward the door. The hallway outside was empty, the faint light from the lamp flickering as it illuminated the worn floorboards. He felt his pulse quicken as he stepped into the hall, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, a coldness creeping over him like a heavy blanket. Elliot turned and glanced at the other rooms, all quiet, their doors shut tight. There were no signs of life, nothing at all. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a murmur just out of reach, but they quickly grew clearer. His mind spun as he listened, straining to catch the words, but they seemed to slip through his grasp like smoke. "Come to us. Find the truth. It's not too late." The voice wasn't one, but many. A chorus of soft, tortured murmurs that sounded like they were coming from every direction at once. Elliot's breath hitched as he looked around, but there was no one in sight. He stepped backward into his room, his eyes darting around as the whispers swirled in his mind, amplifying with each passing second. He slammed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, trying to steady himself. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. This isn't real, he whispered to himself. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They were insistent, growing louder, more desperate. "We are waiting. Find us. See us. Save us." Elliot clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as the voices tore through his thoughts. He staggered back to the bed, trying to block them out. But it was as though they were inside his skull, their words threading themselves into his very being. Elliot's body jerked awake as if he had been dragged from some abyss. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath shallow, but his mind refused to clear. He wasn't in his room anymore. The cold, damp air against his skin, the prickling tension in his bones told him that much. His eyes shot open, searching the dim surroundings, but all he could make out was a deep, unsettling blackness. For a long, endless moment, Elliot didn't know where he was. There was no bed beneath him, no walls to anchor him. Only an overwhelming, suffocating dark. His pulse quickened as panic clawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to engulf him. And then he heard it, the faintest rustle, like something dragging along the floor, too quiet to pinpoint. He froze, waiting for any sound, any sign of what might be in the darkness with him. Rustle. A soft, almost imperceptible noise, too close for comfort. Who's there? Elliot's voice trembled as he called into the void, desperate for an answer, for some reassurance that he wasn't completely alone. The rustling stopped. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. His eyes strained in the darkness, willing the shapes around him to come into focus. Nothing. His hands were clammy as he reached out, feeling the air around him for some sort of clue as to where he was. His fingers brushed against something. Rough. Wood. He could barely make out the texture, but it was unmistakable. A door. A window. Thud. A sound like something heavy falling, muffled by layers of dirt and time. Suddenly it all came rushing back to him. The inn, the whispers, the strange woman in the hallway, the man behind the desk, the figure in room 12, the overwhelming sensation that the very town of Hollowbrook had been waiting for him. The truth had always been hidden here, buried beneath the surface, and now it was clawing its way up, demanding to be seen. Elliot's breath quickened. He reached out again, this time pressing his palm against the cold wood. The door, or whatever it was, creaked open in response, revealing a sliver of light that sliced through the dark like a knife. He stumbled forward, barely able to keep his balance until he reached the threshold. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt a shift, like the room he was stepping into wasn't just a room, but a piece of forgotten time, and it was closing in around him. The air felt different here, older, heavier. The light was dim, faint, like the world had lost its vibrancy. The room was small, the walls lined with tattered bookshelves that seemed to bend under the weight of dust and decay. Books of every shape and size were haphazardly stacked, the pages yellowed with age. The smell of mildew was thick in the air, and the floor was littered with old papers, documents, photographs, faded postcards. They were covered in a fine layer of grime, as though they hadn't been touched in years. But there was something else. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of a large portrait on the far wall, its frame cracked and coated in dust. It was a family portrait, a group of people standing together in front of a house, but the figures in the image, they were all wrong. Their faces were distorted, blurred like something had been deliberately erased from their features. A strange, unnerving blankness hung in the eyes of the people in the portrait, as if they were staring directly into the soul of anyone who dared to look at them. Their mouths were closed, but their expressions were filled with an uncomfortable sense of calm, as though they knew something that Elliot didn't, and they were waiting for him to discover it. As his gaze lingered on the portrait, his feet began to move of their own accord, pulling him toward it, his body reacting without his consent. The whispering voices from earlier had faded into a steady hum in his ears, and a deep, gnawing feeling of inevitability began to settle in his stomach. He was in the heart of it now, the center of the mystery. He reached out to touch the portrait, his fingers hovering just above the frame. A part of him knew he shouldn't, that it might trigger something he wasn't ready for, but the compulsion was too strong. As his fingers brushed against the surface of the painting, the air seemed to shift again. It was subtle at first, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, and then it was gone. The moment was gone, but it left behind a lingering coldness. Elliot pulled his hand away from the portrait, his breath shaky. He turned his head and looked around the room again, this time noticing something new. A door at the far end of the space, partially ajar, leading into what appeared to be a basement or a cellar. It seemed like the natural next step, the place where everything that had been hidden in this room might be revealed. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He knew he should be scared, but a strange, desperate curiosity had taken hold of him. The further he delved into this town's twisted secrets, the more it felt like there was no turning back. He crossed the room quickly, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot, until he stood in front of the door to the cellar. The air around him grew colder still, and the faint hum of the whispers seemed to intensify. He reached for the handle, but just before his hand touched it, a sound stopped him cold. A soft laugh, low and drawn out, like the creaking of old bones. It was coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't the man behind the desk. It wasn't the woman from room 12. This laugh was something else. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting for far longer than any of them. His hand froze just inches from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to pulse around him, as though the walls themselves were breathing, and he felt a terrible certainty that whatever lay beyond this door was not something that could be easily explained. He couldn't stop now. He had to know. He had to see it for himself. With a sharp inhale, Elliot turned the handle and opened the door. The basement was dark. The moment he stepped inside, he was consumed by it, the darkness swallowing him whole. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out shapes in the gloom, shapes that were too large and too jagged to be mere furniture. There were bodies, dozens of them. But these weren't normal bodies. They were twisted, contorted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of fear that had long since turned into something else, something worse. Some were hanging from the ceiling by chains, others sprawled across the floor, their limbs twisted at grotesque angles. But the worst part of it all was that none of them looked old. They looked recent. Their faces still retained a semblance of life, as though they had been preserved in time, frozen in their final moments of terror. And then, in the center of the room, was something even more horrifying. A figure wrapped in tattered rags, its face obscured by a dark hood, was standing motionless in front of an altar. The altar was covered in strange symbols, ancient and unrecognizable, carved into the stone. But it wasn't the symbols that made Elliot's stomach turn. It was the presence of the figure. The figure turned, its face hidden beneath the hood, and Elliot felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself, it spoke. "You should not have come." The whisper was chilling, but there was something more in its tone, something personal. "Now you belong to us." The world around him seemed to shatter as the walls of the cellar closed in. The last thing Elliot saw before everything went black were the eyes, black as night, staring at him from the depths of the shadows. He sank to his knees, his hands gripping the edge of the bed for support. His eyes closed tightly, but the voices persisted. They had found him. They had found their way inside him, and there was no escaping them. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, icy fingers that pressed against his skin with an unsettling familiarity. His body froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't dare open his eyes, didn't want to acknowledge the presence that had materialized behind him. "We are the ones who never left." A voice, clearer now, almost like a sigh, whispered directly into his ear. Elliot's eyes flew open and he whipped around, but there was no one there. The coldness on his shoulder remained, a faint, invisible touch that seemed to linger in the air. The room was thick with it now, heavy with an unbearable weight. Elliot scrambled to his feet, stumbling away from the bed. His pulse was racing, each breath shallow and ragged. He needed to get out, to escape whatever was in this room with him. He rushed to the door and flung it open, his mind reeling with the sound of the whispers, now more urgent, louder than before, but the hallway outside was as empty as before. The silence was unbearable, yet it was suffocatingly full at the same time, an endless loop of tension that threatened to break him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking as he stepped into the hall. "Is anyone there?" The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made his skin crawl. No answers came, just the suffocating weight of the town's silence. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the narrow hall, heading toward the stairs. The whispers continued, threading their way into his mind like a song he couldn't shake. "We are the ones. We are waiting." And then, as if out of nowhere, the door to room 12 creaked open. Elliot stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of something, or someone, watching him from the darkness of the doorway. With a sense of dread building in his chest, he slowly made his way toward the door, his body tense, every step a struggle against the gnawing, terror that had begun to take root in him. The door was barely ajar, and there was no light coming from inside the room. It was as if the darkness had spilled out into the hallway itself, thick and heavy. He reached out for the door, but before he could touch it, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a woman. Her figure was hazy, as if she were made of smoke, but the shape of her was unmistakable. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to be caught in a gust of wind, though there was no breeze. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands, obscuring her face. Elliot's mouth went dry. She was looking at him, though her eyes were hidden by the veil of hair that hung across her face. His voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly stepped forward, her feet gliding over the floor without making a sound. Her presence was like a suffocating fog, and with each step she took, Elliot could feel the temperature in the hall drop further. It was as if her very presence was draining the warmth from the air, leaving behind only the bitter cold. Then, she stopped, right in front of him. She lifted her head, and for the first time, Elliot saw her eyes. They were black, empty pools of darkness, swirling with an endless void that seemed to pull him in. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo, like he was falling into those eyes deeper and deeper into a place where there was no escape. Her mouth barely moved as she spoke, her voice a low, chilling rasp that reverberated through him. "You are not meant to be here." The words seemed to pierce the air, sharp and final. The room around them seemed to grow darker still, as if the very walls were folding in on themselves. Elliot wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey him. His legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor as though an invisible force had pinned him in place. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the woman's eyes burned into him, unblinking, unyielding. "We are waiting, and you are the last to find us." Suddenly, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the sound of the whispers, which now seemed to roar in his ears. Elliot stumbled back, his head spinning. The hallway was empty again. The woman was gone, as if she had never existed at all. But the chill remained, a coldness that seeped into his bones. The whispers didn't stop. "We are waiting. We are waiting." Elliot collapsed against the wall, his body shaking uncontrollably. His mind raced, fighting to make sense of what had just happened. Who was the woman? What was she trying to tell him? And why, in this town, did everything feel like a trap? The answers were out there, buried somewhere in Hollowbrook. But the more Elliot uncovered, the more certain he became of one thing. There was no escape. The town was alive, waiting, and it wouldn't let him leave until it had what it wanted. It was only just beginning. Elliot couldn't breathe. Every inhalation felt like he was drawing in shards of glass, sharp and jagged, suffocating him from the inside. He pressed his hands against the cold walls of the inn, trying to steady himself as the whispers circled in his head like a swarm of insects. His mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened, what he had just seen. Was it real? Was it a hallucination? Or had the town somehow managed to burrow its way inside him, making him a part of its twisted history? The temperature in the hall had dropped even further, and Elliot shivered as he pressed his back to the wall. The shadows around him felt deeper now, stretching into impossible angles. He turned quickly, half expecting to see the woman from room 12 standing behind him, her black eyes watching him with that endless, suffocating gaze. But the hallway remained empty, as silent as it had been when he first arrived. "We are waiting." The voice was distant now, like a far-off echo, but it felt as though it were coming from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the air, from the very ground beneath his feet. The whisper was insistent, gnawing at his thoughts, telling him that he wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to have come to Hollowbrook. He wasn't supposed to uncover its secrets. But he had, and now he was caught in its web. With trembling hands, he reached into his jacket pocket for his phone, hoping that something, anything, could break through the growing terror. His fingers fumbled as he tried to unlock it, but when the screen finally lit up, there was no signal. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. The phone had become as useless as the town itself. A strange noise broke through the silence. Something faint, almost like a low hum. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular, but it filled the air, vibrating against his chest. For a moment, he wondered if the sound was coming from inside the inn, from beneath the floorboards, or even from the very walls themselves. Elliot turned and looked back down the hallway toward the stairs. He had to know what was going on. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. If he didn't keep moving forward, he would drown in it. Taking a deep breath, he turned away from the empty doorways of the other rooms and made his way toward the staircase, each step creaking beneath his weight. As he descended into the dimly lit lobby, the air felt even colder, and the low hum seemed to grow louder, filling every corner of the inn. His footsteps echoed unnervingly, bouncing off the stone walls like the sound of his own fear. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he noticed something strange. The front desk, once empty, now had a figure sitting behind it. The elderly woman, the innkeeper, was gone, replaced by a man. He was tall, with pale, almost translucent skin, and eyes that were unsettlingly dark, like the void. He sat still, unmoving, like a statue carved from stone. His gaze locked on Elliot as if he were expecting him. Elliot's pulse quickened, and instinctively, he stopped in his tracks. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was smooth, too smooth, like silk slipping over cold metal. He didn't seem surprised to see Elliot. In fact, it was as if he had been waiting for him all along. Elliot hesitated before replying. I was looking for someone." The man didn't let him finish. "She is no longer here," he said, his voice almost a whisper, though it carried an ominous weight. "But you should not have come. It's too late for you now." Elliot felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean? What's going on in this town?" The man's lips twitched into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes flickered toward the door, then back to Elliot. "The town remembers everything. Every soul that's ever entered. Every soul that's ever left. But those who stay are never truly gone." He leaned forward, and for the first time, Elliot noticed the faint lines on the man's face, as if he had been here for much longer. Then he appeared. "And you, Mr. Turner, are not leaving this place. Not unless the town allows it." Elliot took a step back, the air thick with dread. "Who are you?" The man stood then, moving with an unnatural grace. His figure was almost too fluid, too perfect in its movements. "I am a watcher," he said simply, his voice filled with an eerie calm. "I watch over this town, and I watch over the ones who come seeking answers. You have seen too much already. You cannot turn back now." Elliot felt his throat tighten, his breath quickening. He wanted to run, to flee this place and never look back. But something held him in place. Something in the man's eyes, or perhaps the weight of the air itself. "You don't understand," Elliot said, his voice shaking. "I'm just here to find the truth. I'm just a writer. The man's gaze darkened, his lips curling into something like a sneer. "The truth," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "You want to know the truth. You've already begun to see it. This town doesn't want the truth to be uncovered. It has its own memory, its own past that it keeps hidden from the world. And now that you've stepped inside, it won't let you leave until it has taken everything from you." Elliot felt his legs tremble beneath him. He couldn't breathe. The weight of the words pressed down on him, suffocating him. This wasn't just a mystery. It was something far darker, far older than he could comprehend. The man smiled again, his expression turning cold. "But you'll find out soon enough. You'll see the past that haunts this place. You'll see what happens to those who refuse to leave. You'll understand what it means to be bound to Hollowbrook." Elliot opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. He turned and fled out the door into the dark night, the air cold and heavy. The hum was louder now, vibrating beneath his skin. His heart raced as he sprinted down the empty street, The town swallowed up in shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The buildings loomed around him like silent sentinels watching, waiting. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if there was anywhere to run. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him. Just a silhouette at first, standing at the edge of the street. Elliot stopped short, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was the woman from room 12. Her face was still hidden by the dark strands of her hair, but her presence was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice no longer just a murmur, but a command. "You've seen too much already." Elliot staggered back, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What do you want from me?" She stepped forward, the shadows around her thickening as if they were alive, twisting and curling like smoke. "We want nothing from you," she said softly. "But the town will take everything." The whispers surged again, louder now, as if they had found their voice all at once. The darkness swallowed him whole. Elliot's mind screamed as it tried to make sense of the darkness that had consumed him. His vision was a blur, like he was drowning in pitch black. He gasped for breath, the air thick and heavy, pressing against his chest, stifling every attempt to inhale. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, as though he were locked in place by an invisible force. But then, slowly, agonizingly, the world began to come back into focus. The murky shadows that surrounded him solidified, and his senses returned, one by one. He could feel the cold stone beneath him, the roughness of the ground pressing into his palms. The musty scent of decay lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of iron. His pulse raced, his heart hammering in his chest, but it was a fight to even move his fingers. Finally, his body obeyed. He twisted his head and slowly opened his eyes, blinking in the dim, flickering light. He was no longer in the cellar. He was standing in the center of a vast chamber, dark, cavernous, and unnervingly cold. The walls were lined with jagged rock, and the ceiling was so high that it disappeared into an endless void. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly with an unnatural, sickly light. They seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, as if they were alive, watching him, drawing him in. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as his gaze drifted down to the floor. He was standing on a circular symbol, its lines drawn in crimson, its edges thick and jagged. It looked ancient, its design twisted and incomprehensible. His feet felt heavy as though something was pulling him down, anchoring him to the spot. He tried to step away, but his legs wouldn't move. A low, guttural hum began to fill the space around him, vibrating through his bones. The very air seemed to shimmer with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The figure in the rags, hooded and silent, was standing in front of him again, though this time there was no altar, no twisted bodies, just the figure, impossibly still, its face hidden beneath the cowl. It was as though time itself had fractured when Elliot had stepped into this place. The world around him felt distorted, as though reality was bending and warping with every passing second. The figure raised its hand again, and this time, there was no mistaking the dark energy that radiated from its presence. The very air around Elliot seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him, filling his lungs with a thick, oppressive force. "You are here now," the figure said, its voice a low, chilling rasp that reverberated through Elliot's chest. It was a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, ancient and unforgiving. "You should not have come. You are bound to us now." Elliot tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the overwhelming pressure that surrounded. He tried to move, to break free from the invisible chains that held him in place, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, as though savoring his terror. It raised its other hand, and a burst of sharp, painful energy shot out toward him. Elliot's body jerked violently as the energy hit him, searing pain lancing through him like fire. "You are not like the others," the figure murmured, its voice softening, almost pained. "You can see it. You can feel it, can't you? This town, its hunger, its thirst for souls. Its curse. Elliot struggled against the weight of its words, the pain that was coursing through his body. He could feel it now, the truth he had been trying to uncover. Hollowbrook was not just a town. It was a living entity, a force that had been feeding for centuries, drawing in anyone who came too close. It was not bound by time or space, and it wasn't just waiting. It was alive. He thought back to the faces in the portrait, those blurred, hollow eyes, to the strange woman in the hallway, to the people in the basement. This was what they had all become. This was the fate that awaited anyone who dared to uncover the town's truth. "You will join us," the figure continued, its words now more insistent. "Like all the others, like all who have come before you. You can never leave. This town takes what it needs. It takes your soul, your memory, your very essence." The figure's hand moved forward, and before Elliot could react, something sharp and cold pressed against his chest. It was as though invisible tendrils were reaching into him, prying apart his soul, unraveling it thread by thread. Elliot gasped, his body fighting against the unnatural grip that was tightening around him. He could feel himself slipping, his thoughts blurring, his memories fading like wisps of smoke. He had come to Hollowbrook seeking answers, but now he could feel the truth slipping away from him, as though the town itself was erasing him, rewriting his existence. "No," he gasped, his voice cracking. "I won't let you do this." But the figure was unmoved. Its gaze, hidden beneath the dark cowl, never wavered as it continued its work, drawing more and more of his essence into the darkness. It was feeding. The entire town was feeding. And then a new sound broke through the suffocating silence. A sound that Elliot almost didn't recognize at first. A voice, familiar, comforting. "Elliot." He turned sharply, his head snapping in the direction of the voice. The figure's grip on him loosened for just a moment, and in that brief instant the world around him seemed to shift. For a heartbeat, everything felt normal again, as though the darkness had been momentarily pushed back. "Elliot," the voice said again, more urgently this time. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a silhouette against the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by the dim light, but there was something unmistakable about her presence. "Maggie," Elliot croaked, barely able to form the words. The woman nodded, her eyes full of sorrow. She was the woman from the inn, from room 12. She had been there all along. "You're not the first," she said softly, her voice laced with pain. "You're not the first to try and escape it, but you can't. None of us can. We're all bound to this place now." Elliot struggled to move, but the figure tightened its grip on him, pulling him back into the center of the circle. He felt the pull of Hollowbrook's hunger, its endless, insatiable need, and it was tearing at him, unraveling everything that made him who he was. Maggie's eyes filled with pity. "There's no way out, Elliot. Not for you, not for any of us. Once it has you, it doesn't let go." Elliot wanted to scream, to fight back, but his voice was lost in the overwhelming darkness, drowned beneath the weight of the town's ancient hunger. He felt his mind start to slip, his thoughts turning to dust, scattering like ashes in the wind. And as his vision began to fade, the last thing he heard was Maggie's voice, whispering one final truth. "The town takes, and it never lets go." Then there was only silence. Elliot woke with a start, gasping for air as though he had been submerged underwater for far too long. His lungs burned, his heart thundering in his chest. His body felt weightless, yet stiff, as if it didn't belong to him. His skin was slick with sweat, his muscles sore and trembling, but there was no pain. There was only the disorienting confusion of not knowing where he was, or how he had gotten there. He blinked against the sudden light that flooded his vision. The shadows in his eyes cleared, and he found himself sitting on a worn wooden floor. The cold, unyielding wood pressed into his palms, and a flickering light above him illuminated the room, dim, faint, but enough to make out the shapes around him. The room was a prison. The walls were jagged stone, like the inside of a cavern, and there were no windows, only narrow slits of light cutting through the cracks. was impossible to tell where the light came from, but the air was damp, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as he pushed himself to his feet, unsteady and disoriented. His hands moved instinctively to his sides, but they were bare. No jacket, no phone. He didn't even have shoes. Where am I? His voice was raw, a rasping sound that felt foreign in his throat. The only answer was the echo of his own words bouncing off the cold stone walls. He tried to remember what had happened, what had led him here, but his mind felt like a shattered mirror. Each piece of memory, each fragment, was twisted and wrong. He remembered the figure, the shadow, the basement, the altar. Hollowbrook itself, feeding on him like a parasite, but now it was as though he had been pulled out of time, out of reality, into some place where the rules no longer applied. He staggered toward the far wall, his bare feet scraping against the rough stone floor. There was a narrow door, barely visible, in the shadows, but something about it made his skin crawl. It was just wrong, like it had never been meant to be opened, never meant to be found. His hand reached for the doorknob, but it was icy to the touch, the metal slick and cold. The second his fingers wrapped around the knob, the world seemed to shift, his surroundings blurred, colors and shapes spinning in an erratic frenzy. His vision swam. The walls stretched, elongated into terrifying shapes. The stone beneath his feet seemed to melt, and the air grew thick with the taste of something acrid, something like burning metal. Elliot stumbled back, gasping as the world around him folded in on itself. He closed his eyes tightly, his pulse thundering in his ears. No, this can't be happening. This is just a dream. He opened his eyes again, but everything had changed. The room was gone. The door was gone. He was standing in a different place entirely, a place that felt like a dream, but one that he couldn't escape from. He was surrounded by towering trees, old, gnarled things, their branches twisted like fingers reaching into the sky. The forest was suffocating. The trees loomed over him like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching far beyond their reach. There was no sun here, no light, only a gray, oppressive sky overhead, heavy and ominous. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and in the distance faint whispers hung in the air, too quiet to be understood, but loud enough to feel like a presence, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. Where am I? He whispered again, but the question felt empty. No one was there to answer. It was like speaking into a void. He reached out a hand toward one of the trees, but the moment his fingers touched the bark, something jolted through him. Sharp, like a shock of electricity, and a wave of images flooded his mind. The images were fragmented, distorted, but he could see enough. Hollowbrook. The figures, people perhaps, but not people, not quite. Their eyes were hollow, empty, just like the ones he had seen in the portrait. They were standing in the town square, their forms shifting, flickering between the living and the dead. They were trapped in a never-ending loop, moving between moments in time, caught in the town's curse. His stomach churned. He pulled his hand back, his skin tingling as though something had marked him, left a trace of itself on him. And then, through the haze of his disjointed thoughts, he heard the voice again. You're dreaming. It wasn't the figure in the rags, it wasn't Maggie. This voice was different, softer, more familiar. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around him like a blanket, its presence suffocating and warm at the same time. This is the in-between, the voice continued. The space between worlds, between the living and the dead, between the past and the present. The place where Hollowbrook's curse begins and ends. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest as the forest seemed to close in on him, its twisted trees pressing together like a tightening grip. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, like it was shifting, alive, as if the earth itself was breathing. What? Are you? Elliot gasped, his voice trembling. He tried to make sense of what was happening, but it was impossible. Nothing here made sense. I am the dreamer, the voice replied, its tone softer now, almost sympathetic. I am the one who waits, the one who remembers. Elliot's mind reeled. The dreamer? The voice didn't answer right away. The air shifted, and the trees around him seemed to whisper in unison, their branches shaking as though they were alive, their leaves rustling with intent. And then, through the shifting shadows, a figure emerged. At first, it was nothing but a blur, just a shadow moving in the corner of his vision. But then it came into focus, and Elliot staggered backward. In shock, it was the woman from room 12, her face just as he remembered it, pale, her black hair hanging loosely around her face. But she wasn't the same. There was something wrong with her, something unnatural. Her eyes were wide, but not in fear. They were blank. Hollow. You, Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. You're here. You were... I was never truly alive, she interrupted, her voice hollow, emotionless. I was one of the first to come to Hollowbrook. Her eyes fixed on him, the emptiness of them suffocating. I stayed. I didn't leave. None of us did. And now, her voice faltered, and for a moment there was a flicker of something human, something that resembled fear, before it was swallowed by the emptiness. Now you are here, with us. Elliot shook his head, his mind spinning. What do you mean? What do you want from me? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached out with a trembling hand, and as her fingers brushed against him, the world around him shifted again. The forest melted away, replaced by something darker, something colder. A vision unfolded before him. Images, memories, flashes of light. It was Hollowbrook, but it was no longer the town he had seen. It was something older, something worse. He saw the people of the town, their faces distorted, their bodies twisted as they knelt in worship. They were bound to something dark and ancient, their souls given to the curse of Hollowbrook. You see it now, the woman whispered, her voice a soft echo in the night. You see what we are, what we've become. The dreamer takes us all, and the curse of Hollowbrook lives forever. Elliot stumbled backward, the weight of the truth crushing him. He had thought he was just uncovering a mystery, but Hollowbrook was not a mystery. It was a prison, a place that fed on souls, and once you entered, there was no leaving. He turned, his legs unsteady as the shadows grew taller and darker around him. He could feel it now, feel the curse of the town crawling beneath his skin, sinking deeper with each breath he took. And then, through the thickening darkness, he heard it again. That voice, soft and sweet, almost a lullaby. You're not leaving, not ever. Welcome to the dream. The last thing Elliot felt was the cold, the chilling embrace of Hollowbrook's curse as it wrapped around him, pulling him into the depths of its eternal nightmare. And then, there was only the darkness. Elliot's mind swirled in darkness. It was as if he had been suspended in time, caught between waking and dreaming, his very soul torn in two. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, like he was trapped in molasses, struggling to reach the surface but sinking deeper into a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. His body ached, but he couldn't feel the source of the pain, just a dull throb in the pit of his chest that intensified with every breath. When the world around him started to come back into focus, it wasn't the warm light of day he expected, nor the cold stone walls of his earlier surroundings. It was a place worse than either. A place that had once been a town but had long since died. A forgotten graveyard of memories and souls. Hollowbrook. The street stretched out before him like the skeletal remains of something that had been swallowed by time itself. Buildings sagged under the weight of decay, their windows shattered, their doors hanging from rusted hinges. It was silent here, too silent, as though even the wind was afraid to move through the ruins. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of something metallic, blood perhaps, or something darker, older. The town was no longer just a place, it was a tomb. It was an ever-hungry thing, a creature with a pulse, with a mind of its own. Elliot's heart raced as he stumbled forward, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He had to get out, had to leave. But every turn, every street corner led him deeper into the town's grasp, as though it were shifting around him, folding in on itself. He thought he saw figures in the distance, dark shapes darting between, the ruins of houses flickering in and out of view like ghostly images. But when he focused, they were gone. His mind was playing tricks on him, surely. Hollowbrook had a way of distorting reality, making everything feel wrong, like the ground underfoot had been twisted, warped by some ancient curse. But something else was here too, something that gnawed at him from the edges of his consciousness. A presence that made his skin crawl and his pulse quicken. It was familiar, but not. It felt like he was being watched, like something or someone was waiting for him to realize the truth. "You should have never come," a voice whispered, the words slithering through his thoughts like a serpent's hiss. Elliot froze, every muscle tensing. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he scanned the street around him. But he saw nothing, no one. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "You think you're still alive, don't you?" It was a woman's voice, low, eerie, almost a lullaby. But the words didn't belong here. They were an echo, a memory, a sound from a life long forgotten. "Who's there?" Elliot called out, his voice strained, panic rising in his throat. Nothing answered, but the voice continued, mocking him. "You're still dreaming, Elliot. This is just another layer, another illusion, another trap." The truth of her words hung in the air, suffocating. We were all trapped here. All of us who came, who thought they could escape the curse, the lost ones, the dreamers. You're one of them now. Elliot's breath came faster. His knees felt weak, his vision swimming in and out of focus. He was losing his grip, slipping between worlds again. Between the waking and the dreaming, between the living and the dead. "Who are you?" he choked out. "What do you want from me?" "I was like you once," the voice replied, softer now, almost sympathetic. "I came to Hollowbrook looking for answers. I thought I could solve its mystery. I thought I could break the curse, but I was wrong." The voice paused, and for a long moment, there was only the quiet whisper of the wind brushing against the crumbling walls. Then it spoke again. "You're already one of us, Elliot, one of the lost ones." A chill ran down his spine. Lost ones? Before he could process what that meant, the ground beneath him trembled. The earth rumbled like the town itself was alive, waking from some long slumber. Elliot's body jerked forward, his heart skipping a beat. He turned in time to see something, someone, emerging from the shadows of the nearby alley. A figure, a man. He was hunched over, his clothes ragged, his face obscured by a hood. He moved like a puppet, slow and jerky, his movements stiff and unnatural, as if he were trapped in the same nightmare that Elliot had become part of. The man's face was hollow, emaciated, with dark pits where his eyes should have been. And then, slowly, the figure lifted his head, revealing his eyes, or, the hollow sockets where they had once been. But it wasn't just his eyes that were missing. There was something else. Something inside him that had been hollowed out completely. His lips parted, and a rasping, breathless voice emerged. "We are the lost ones. We came here, like you." "Looking for something?" The man's voice cracked as if it hadn't been used in years. "But we found nothing. Nothing but the darkness and the hunger." Elliot backed away, his pulse racing. He couldn't tear his eyes from the man's twisted form, but at the same time, he felt as though he were being drawn closer, as though something inside of him wanted to understand, wanted to know the truth. "You'll become like us," the man rasped, his voice gaining strength. "You'll forget who you were. You'll forget what you came for. You'll become one with Hollowbrook, its hunger, its thirst for souls. It takes everything." Elliot's head spun. He couldn't think. He couldn't process what was happening. He had to leave, he had to get out of here. But the town's pull was too strong. The streets bent and twisted like living things, pushing him deeper into their grasp. The man, No, the thing that had once been a man took a step forward, and the world seemed to crack open around them. The town's curse was alive, shifting, and pulsing with an insatiable hunger. It was waiting for him to fall into the same trap that had claimed every other soul that had ever entered Hollowbrook. The man's hollow eyes burned into Elliot's soul. There's no escape, Elliot. Hollowbrook claims us all. It doesn't let go. Elliot wanted to scream, but the words were trapped inside him, his throat closing up as the presence of the lost ones grew stronger, crowding in on him, suffocating him with their hollow gazes. They were everywhere now. Dark, twisted figures, rising from the shadows, their bodies contorted and broken, their faces drained of life. They were the forgotten, the consumed, the lost. The town had already taken them, and soon it would take him too. As the lost ones closed in, their whispers growing louder, Elliot felt something snap within him. His mind shattered, splintering, into 1,000 pieces, all of them lost in the fog of Hollowbrook's curse. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse around him, a familiar voice broke through the darkness. Elliot, wake up. He turned, desperate, but the world was already spinning, and all that was left was the hollow, endless night. And then, there was only silence. Elliot's consciousness floated in a liminal space, caught between the world of the living and something far darker. The silence pressed against him, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. He couldn't feel his body, couldn't remember what it was like to be whole. All he knew was the darkness, a consuming black that stretched endlessly, in every direction, as though he were drowning in a void that refused to release him. But then, there was a tug. At first it was subtle, a slight shift in the air, a whisper, a crackling sound beneath the overwhelming silence. It was like a distant beckoning voice, calling him back from wherever he had drifted. He didn't know whether it was real, whether he could trust it, but something in him, something primal, something that refused to be consumed, stirred in response. Elliot. The voice was familiar, but so faint it was as though it was coming from far away, lost in the folds of time. A name, a simple word, but it resonated within him like a distant echo. It was the last thread connecting him to his humanity. He followed it. He had to follow it. Suddenly, his body surged with sensation. Pain, dizziness, the cold weight of the world pressing down on him. The ground beneath him was rough, jagged. His palms scraped against the cold earth, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. He blinked, forcing his eyes to open, and what he saw made his heart freeze. He was back in Hollowbrook, but it wasn't the Hollowbrook he remembered. This town was alive in a way it had never been before. The streets were alive with shadows, stretching and twisting like hungry tendrils. The buildings leaned toward him, their windows like gaping mouths, their walls covered in strange symbols that writhed as if they were alive. Every corner, every surface was marked with the same unshakable sense of wrongness that had plagued him from the beginning. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just voices anymore. They were feelings, emotions, ancient and desperate, clawing at him from every direction. "You're one of us now," they said. "You're part of the dream, part of the curse." The shadows in the distance shifted. Figures emerged from the darkness, walking slowly toward him. At first he thought they were more of the lost ones, the twisted, souls that had fallen victim to Hollowbrook's insatiable hunger. But as they came into view, Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was them. Maggie, the woman in room 12, the townspeople, all of them. Their faces were pale, drained of life, their eyes wide and hollow, empty sockets that seemed to look straight through him. They walked like sleepwalkers, moving in slow, deliberate steps, each one just a little too wrong to be human. And then he saw it, the thing that had been haunting him since the moment he arrived. It was standing at the center of the square, a towering dark figure that loomed like a storm cloud. Its shape was indistinct, shifting, but there was no mistaking the presence. It was the heart of Hollowbrook, the source of everything, the Dreamer, it sees you. Maggie's voice whispered in his ear, and he realized with a jolt that she was standing beside him now, her form flickering in and out like a fading image. It knows you're awake, Elliot. You're here. With us. Forever. He turned to her, the panic rising in his chest. No, I can't be. I can't stay here. But she was already fading, vanishing into the shadows, her voice lingering, echoing in his mind. You already are. You can't leave. The air grew colder. The whispers grew louder, all of them speaking at once. The townspeople gathered around him, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Each of their voices was layered with grief, desperation, and something darker. Their mouths didn't move, but the words still seeped into his mind. Help us, and the voices whispered. Save us. But how could he save them? How could he save anyone when they were already gone? Hollowbrook was a tomb, and they were its prisoners, its ghosts, its memories. They had all come here, seeking something, hoping for answers, but in the end they had been consumed by the curse. Hollowbrook had taken everything, and now it was trying to take him too. Elliot took a step back, his feet unsteady, the ground seeming to ripple beneath him. The town shifted again, the buildings leaning in closer, the streets warping, bending like an endless maze. The figure at the center of the square grew taller, its shape coalescing into something more defined, more solid. He could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on him. You're here, the figure said, its voice resonating in his bones, in his very soul. You're part of the dream now, Elliot. You can never leave. You never will. Elliot's breath quickened as the darkness closed in, the ground beneath him trembling. He could see the figure now, clearer than before. It was tall, its features distorted, a silhouette of a person, but its face was nothing, just a void, an absence that seemed to swallow the light. Its form flickered like it was struggling to remain whole, to stay anchored in the waking world. You are mine now, it whispered, and the words sent a shiver down his spine. You'll never wake again. The sound of the voice was suffocating. It filled his mind, drowning out everything else. The people of Hollowbrook surrounded him, their forms melting into the shadows, their hollow gazes burning into his very soul. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run, but in the deepest part of him something refused to yield. Something that had survived the terror, the horror, the nightmares. It was the last shred of his humanity, the one thing that hadn't been consumed by the curse. And just as the figure reached out to claim him, just as its hands, shadowy and cold, brushed against his skin, Elliot did the one thing he hadn't dared to do before. He screamed. The scream wasn't just an escape, it was a defiance, a challenge. And in that defiance, a crack appeared. The air around him shimmered, and for a brief moment the curse loosened its grip. The darkness faltered, the whispers faded, but it wasn't enough. The figure was still there, its hand stretched out, pulling him in. And Elliot realized with a chilling clarity that Hollowbrook would never let him go. Not until it had claimed him fully. Not until he had become just another forgotten soul, lost to the dream forever. And in that moment, Elliot understood. There was no escape from Hollowbrook. There never had been. Elliot's scream echoed through the collapsing town, a desperate cry that reverberated off the warped walls of Hollowbrook. The sound cut through the oppressive silence, the one thing he had left to cling to in a world that was quickly falling apart. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to give in, to let the darkness consume him. But even as his voice filled the air, the figure, the nightmare that had haunted him from the very start, kept advancing, its hand reaching for him, its presence pressing down on him like a weight he could never escape. The town seemed to shift. With every breath he took, the buildings groaned and creaked as if they were alive, moving, breathing. The ground beneath his feet trembled, cracking open like a fissure in the earth, swallowing whole pieces of the town as though it was hungry, as though it were devouring itself. The shadows that stretched out from every corner of Hollowbrook grew longer, more sinister. coiling around him like tendrils, trapping him, suffocating him. He had nowhere to go. "You can't escape," the figure's voice whispered, low and menacing. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a feeling that thrummed deep within his bones, making his chest tight, his heart pound with a sickening dread. "Hollowbrook is mine, and so are you." Elliot staggered backward, his eyes scanning the ruins, searching for any escape, any way out of the nightmare that was consuming him. But the streets had shifted again. Everything was wrong, distorted. Nothing made sense anymore. The town had become a living thing, and it was determined to drag him down into its endless darkness. For a moment he thought of Maggie, of the woman who had tried to warn him. Her ghostly form, her faded whispers. Had she been trying to help him all along? Or had she too fallen victim to the same fate that awaited him? She had called him a dreamer, just as the figure had. A lost soul trapped in Hollowbrook's eternal nightmare. But why? Why had they all come here? He glanced back at the figure, now standing just a few feet away, its featureless face looming above him. Its body was shifting, flickering, as if it were barely able to hold itself together. In the black void where its face should have been, Elliot could see something. Something terrible. Something that threatened to swallow his very sense of self. He saw the town reflected in the emptiness. A vast landscape of broken buildings, twisted trees and shadowed streets. It was a place, but it was also a thing. Something ancient and hungry, and it had been waiting for him. "Why me?" Elliot shouted, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. "What do you want from me?" The figure's void of a face seemed to pulse, and for a brief moment Elliot thought he saw something flicker inside it. A flicker of recognition, of knowledge that was both familiar and ancient. "You've always been here, Elliot," the voice answered, distorted and echoing through the very air around him. "You've always been part of the dream." Elliot's mind reeled. What was it talking about? Had he been chosen? Had his arrival in Hollowbrook been inevitable? His thoughts swirled in chaos, each one crashing into the next. He wasn't sure if the figure was lying, if it was trying to break him, or if this was something deeper than he could even understand. But then something inside him snapped. In a moment of clarity, a sudden and overwhelming realization filled him. He wasn't just trapped in Hollowbrook. He had been woven into its very fabric. He had come here as so many others had, seeking answers, seeking truth. But Hollowbrook didn't give answers. It didn't allow truth. It only gave torment, pain, and madness, and it fed on the very souls that dared to trespass into its nightmare. But there was something else too, something deeper than the hunger, a terrible, all-encompassing need. The town had been waiting for him. It had always been waiting. Elliot's mind raced as he struggled to make sense of the fragments of memory and half-forgotten thoughts that rushed through him. There were whispers, whispers that had never really left him. The dreams, the strange, feeling that something was watching him, pulling him in from the moment he read that letter. The letter that had come from nowhere but felt like it had been written for him. "You were always going to be the one," the figure said again, its voice growing darker. The one who would wake up? Elliot understood now. He wasn't a victim of circumstance, he had been chosen. He had always been part of the plan, part of the curse. Hollowbrook fed off the dreamers, the seekers, the ones who thought they could find truth and escape. But there was no escape, only feeding, only becoming part of the nightmare. He thought of the people who had been lost here. Maggie, the man from the alley, all the others who had vanished without a trace. Had they known the truth? Had they known they could never leave? Had they, too, thought they could break the cycle? Or had they accepted their fate like so many before them? "You're one of us now," the figure hissed, its hands closing around him, pulling him toward the void. Elliot fought, but it was hopeless. The shadows closed in around him, a dark tide rising to swallow him whole. His heart pounded in his chest, and in the final moment, as the figure's cold, featureless face pressed closer, he realized the truth. He was already gone. Hollowbrook had claimed him. It had claimed them all. The town was more than a place. It was a parasite, a dream, a living nightmare that existed beyond the waking world. And once it had you, there was no waking up. There was only the endless cycle, the unending torment, the eternal hunger. The figure's hands tightened around him, its voice now an overwhelming force in his mind. There is no escape. There never was. And as the darkness enveloped him, Elliot's final thought was a hollow, empty echo. He had become just another lost soul, another forgotten dream, and Hollowbrook, as it always had, continued to hunger. Will Elliot uncover the truth behind Hollowbrook before it consumes him completely? Or will he become just another lost soul in its eternal nightmare? Dive into the chilling mystery now, and experience the terror that lies within Hollowbrook, if you dare.